She was born at the start of the 19th century, the daughter of a stalwart American family with patriot roots buried deep in the American Revolution. By the time her days were finished, she would travel coast to coast, a rare accomplishment that few of her generation achieved. In a 19th century man's world, she would distinguish herself not by worldly accomplishments measured in money and monuments, but she instead would have to fight just to keep her family together, and in the end, after great physical and spiritual struggles, she would overcome in establishing a family of faith. She became a model for the modern Westover women who would follow her, an example of devotion, obedience, patience, and endurance. Of her, it could be truly said, she stood in a holy place and was not moved. Her name is Electa Westover, the first of the Westover family to join the LDS Church. Electa married her true love, Alexander Westover, in 1824, and over the next 10 years added 4 sons to their family. Though quite poor, the family's future looked bright as they worked the homestead in Goshen, Ohio, nearby where Electa's parents had also chosen to settle. Electa foresaw her days being spent in this place, raising children and grandchildren with the man that she loved. But death took one young son while an infant away from her, and then, tragically, Alexander died due to illness in 1834, shattering those dreams and throwing Electa's life into chaos and uncertainty. Alexander's passing, in effect, broke up the family. Electa couldn't run the farm herself, and sons Edwin, Charles, and Oscar, between the ages of 5 and 9, were just too young to really contribute. With no way to support her children, Electa had to send her boys away to other family members and neighbors, an act that broke her heart and threw their futures into uncertainty. For the next 10 years, Electa wandered spiritually, looking for ways to get her family back together and praying for answers to her questions why. Those answers came a decade later in 1844, when Mormon missionaries were sent 60 miles from the home of her convert sister, bringing with them a message of eternal life as families. Electa took to the waters of baptism on the 19th of August, 1844. By this time, her boys were either entering young adulthood or experiencing the critical years of youth. Little did Electa know that her decade-long journey as a widow and newfound testimony as a Latter-day Saint would be of service to her 20-year-old son, Edwin. Edwin had married the year before, and he and his wife Sarah began their family when Edwin Jr. was born. But 3 months after the baby was born, Sarah died, leaving Edwin a widower and Edwin Jr. without a mother. Electa stepped in to care for the baby's physical needs and for her mourning son's spiritual crisis. It was an act of service and testimony she would repeat often over the remaining course of her life. Less than a month after Electa joined the church, Edwin followed and joined her on a quest to have his family restored to him through the promises of the temple. Together they moved to winter quarters, and in 1848 were part of Brigham Young's second wagon train west. It was part of that massive company that Edwin found another bride, also named Sarah, who he married after arriving in Salt Lake. That trek reunited a once-shattered family group. Electa traveled together with her sons, her sisters, and Sarah's family as well. Electa was recognized as matriarch, a steady influence of faith that would be a guiding light for her young sons now as priesthood holders. She would never be separated from her family again. They arrived in Salt Lake at the end of the first harvest of the original 1847 pioneers. Food was scarce, and Edwin and Charles barely had time to build a small cabin with a sod roof near the corner of 4th South and 5th East in Salt Lake City. They survived that first winter and later moved south to Cottonwood, where Edwin and Charles were able to work a larger farm. It was there that both sons took on plural wives, and Electa's life became consumed with caring for mothers and grandbabies as her family expanded and responded to the calls of church service. Electa was devout. She harbored great hope that the temples would be built so that she could be sealed to Alexander, and in turn, her children sealed to both of them. When the period of the Great Mormon Reformation of the 1850s brought rebaptism for many Latter-day Saints, Electa was obedient in her recommitment to the faith. The principle of sealing was taught and retaught at that time, and in obedience, Electa was sealed to 2 men, Eleazar Miller and Chauncey Loveland, 2 faithful brethren who numbered amongst some of the earliest of Mormon pioneers. But neither man lived nearby, and Electa would not leave her sons again, opting to stay with them and to retain her Westover name. Where her sons were called to go, Electa felt called to go. When Edwin helped with church projects in Grantsville, he and his families and Electa stayed for a time in the home of Electa's faithful sister Hannah. Later, when sons Charles and Edwin were called to Utah's Dixie, Electa would go with them to spend the rest of her life there, supporting their efforts to fulfill their missions. Electa's devotion to family never let up. While Edwin and young Charles embraced the gospel, her youngest son Oscar rejected it, and in his young adult years pushed off to California. When Oscar married and had children and endured the untimely passing of his young wife, it was Electa who went to the rescue, spending a period of time in California so that Oscar could rearrange things for his family. Electa returned to southern Utah, where her sons contributed to the building of the St. George Temple, a place that would occupy a great deal of her time over the final days of her life. Before her son Edwin passed, he was able to accompany Electa to the temple and finally see to the ordinances that would seal Electa to Alexander more than 40 years after his passing. There they would do work for many of their kindred dead. Edwin suffered an untimely death in 1877, leaving a wife and children in northern Utah and a wife and children in northern Arizona. Electa would continue to support both of these families, sending letters to those who were far away and rendering aid to those who were close by. She was beloved by her grandchildren. For her final 10 years, she focused on family service and temple attendance, where she faithfully served until she passed in 1889, a true pioneer woman, firm in the faith and hopeful for the reunion she would have at last with Alexander. Join us at WestoverFamilyHistory.org as we recount the thousands of descendants of Mother Electa Beale Westover in our attempt to tell their stories of faith, hope, and love.